Hello and welcome back to another video on this channel. Today we are going to be responding to a video made by The Truth Hurts called Why Don't Atheists Kill Themselves? Now, of course, this is one of the topics that I enjoy a lot. Existentialism, ideas, Christian existentialism, Sartre, all these concepts is something that I really enjoy. Ethics as well. So as a result, I thought this is perhaps the best video that I could respond to his channel. You guys said in the recent poll I sent out that you like response videos a lot, so as a result I decided to make this video for you. Now, a lot of people also send me other videos of The Truth Hurts to respond to. The reason why I don't respond to them is because I think that they either don't attack or argue against a form of Christianity that I hold to, and as a result I'm like, well, what's the point of me defending it? And in another way, I don't think that it's interacting with a very philosophically nuanced form of Christianity and kind of provide a very surface level or superficial discussion, not as like an argument or a critique of him, but rather that I think the conversation that is had, the dialogue between the ideas that he's critiquing and the arguments he gives against it, both are rather superficial, though they don't really interact with the core of the Christian message or the ideas that I believe in. As a result, I just don't respond to them. There's no reason, although these videos actually do quite well for my YouTube channel, I don't think there's any point of making these videos for the sake of making them. I think I should only make them when they actually have significant content to discuss. Now, of course, if you have any problems with them, then let me know in the comments or reach out to me on Discord or on email. I have had a few of you people who have responded to my last or watched my last Truth Hurts video. I will put a card up to that above, who actually responded to it, reached out to me on Discord. So, of course, there's always that opportunity for you to ask further questions, have further discussions, give me a call or something like that. Of course, if it's a call, then please arrange a time with me and I'll try to find some time to talk to you. But I'm always here to interact and discuss these issues with you. These are very important existential issues, and it's very important that we have understanding of it. So with that out of the way, let us get right into this video. Now, before we get into this video, I'd like to remind you that we are actually going to be going over a few concepts before we get actually into the video, just because I think that if we start off with a few principles in the beginning, it will be more clear, more easy to understand instead of me talking a lot, watching a bit, talking a lot. Rather, I can just talk a lot in the front and then just refer you back to the starting points. That might be a bit helpful. It's a new format that I'm trying out and hopefully you enjoy. Of course, if the truther is watching this, I don't think he will, but if he is, then feel free to reach out to me. I'll happily have this discussion with you. Now, the first thing I want to talk about is the difference between the creation of meaning and the intrinsic meaning raised by Christians. I want to make it very clear to start off with that we're not arguing against the creation of meaning, but rather the intrinsic nature of those meanings are different. The creation of meaning is this idea that when there is no meaning, I can create my meaning subjectively, and that is something dependent on whatever I want to do in the situation I am in. Now, just be very clear with the semantics here is that this creation of meaning isn't something objective. It isn't something necessarily true. So when you want to judge it, it can't actually be judged. This is not a truth claim. When you're saying my meaning is X, Y, and Z, it's a truth claim in the sense that it is true to you. It's not something which is wrong, but rather it's not something which can be judged or argued towards. In the same way, it cannot be proved by science, supported by arguments, or anything philosophical. And it enters into a realm of supra-truth, if you want to call it meta-truth, perhaps, something which isn't necessarily judged by the truth, but nevertheless is a very strong part of the human experience. And this perhaps brings it away from the truth hurts or the truth idea and to something which is beyond. And as a result, I perhaps it will lead to someone to say that, well, there is nothing wrong with creating that, but there's also nothing wrong with someone still believing in God despite the lack of evidence for it, just due to the same existential structure that both of the meanings have. They're created in both ways, perhaps. And I'm not saying that there is no evidence for God, but just for the sake of the argument here, you can see that that is a logical conclusion for allowing people to create their meanings, and that we have to have consistency on both sides. Now, of course, the second thing that I want to touch upon is the idea that when we're talking about, of course, he's responding to the idea of why don't atheists kill themselves. I think we have to look at it as a negative statement instead of a positive statement. And a good illustration of this would be Dostoevsky's famous quote, if there is no immortality of the soul, then everything is permissible. Now, you might be saying, oh, it should actually be, if there is no God, then everything is permissible. But actually, that is not found in the Dostoevskian text. The idea is indeed found there, but actually the text in the Brothers Karamazov is there if there is no immortality of the soul. So, and I think that this phrase demonstrates very clearly what I'm trying to say here, because when we're looking at if there is no immortality of the soul, what that actually says is, well, if this doesn't occur, if God doesn't exist, or if this value, the source of value doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. It's not saying then you should go kill yourself, or oh, then you should go murder people. And that's why I don't agree with when atheists or Christians say, oh, you don't believe in God, why aren't you killing yourself? That's not the correct question. But then the question is like, why are you not killing yourself? There's a double negative. They're saying, well, what is the problem with this? What is the problem with X, Y, and Z? And where are you actually getting that justification from, that moral justification for what is wrong? Not instead of saying, well, what is right? Because then there is no judgment. And in the same question, you'll flip around and say, well, it's not just why don't atheists kill themselves? It's also why do atheists live? It's the same idea of saying, well, it's not saying you should go kill yourself, or oh, you should go murdering, or you should not murder, but also why are you doing charity, or why are you searching meaning? There is that lack of justification apart from one's subjective imposition to decide it. And that's completely fine if that's the line of argument that you want to go down. But of course, it goes and brings back to the idea of there's nothing then wrong with just being a Christian despite the lack of evidence, or someone just creating God, knowing that there is no God, but creating God to fulfill that existential gap in their lives. And that is something that we have to interact with. And of course, I think in the video, I've watched the video once or twice, I think the lad says, well, that might be a very childish belief, but I'll disagree on the same basis that I have said above, and we'll interact with that a bit more later. Finally, I would think that there has to be a clear separation between science and meaning. The reason for this is precisely because the realm of science is very different from the realm of meaning. I'll talk about this in a bit more depth later on, but just note that there are two very, very different things. It's very easy to say, oh yeah, I'm deriving all my meaning from science, but I think it's a very childish belief to say, oh yes, someone's actually living their entire life based on science. No one actually does that. I think anyone with any psychological nuance will know that people's interactions with the world aren't based on science. Whether you're an atheist, you're a religious person, there are things in the world which go beyond merely this empirical fact or the empirical world that you're living in. No matter how strict of an empiricist you are, everyone lives based on this meaning. So that out of the way, let us get right into the video. I know it's quite a long time, but understand, and I hope you will understand soon, that having these 3 points laid out to you will make the response way, way easier. So now let me go and get into the video.
Right now, a huge number of people will be experiencing a major existential crisis. Until recently, their entire world had been orientated around their God. Their meaning, their purpose, their hope was all derived solely from their religion. But now, they contemplate life-shattering ideas. What if they are just molecules in motion? Yet another animal that will decompose and be forgotten about within only years of their inevitable death. Just thinking about these ideas and questions can be perplexing and painful. It leads some people to post comments on my videos, such as, so what's the point of life? Like, are we here to die and be nothing, or what? If this is all the life, then is it worth living? So if not believing in even any God, what's the purpose to life then? Why am I even here? I could just kill myself, and then all of this ends. Why don't atheists kill themselves? If life has no purpose and meaning, then what's the point of life? As a Jehovah's Witness, I would have fully agreed, perhaps not with the specific wording, but with the sentiment behind these comments. However, as an atheist, I now view them as childish, as narcissistic, as highly irrational.
Okay, let's stop it right there. And I think that this perhaps illustrates the point very clearly. It's this idea of, well, let's go back to these comments over here. And we were saying, well, this is exactly the point when I say this is a negative statement instead of a positive. It's not necessarily, the question should not be why don't atheists kill themselves, but rather why are atheists alive, or well, actually everything is permissible. It doesn't matter what they're doing or not. It's like there is no actual goal. And in some degree, this does indeed illustrate an interesting point, though I don't think it actually fully encapsulates the issue. And by saying or reducing it to why don't atheists kill themselves, it actually changes the problem, or at least the philosophical problem that is raised by a philosophical or Christian thinkers like Dostoevsky and others. Now, furthermore, I think that it's very interesting that he touches on this idea of angst. This, of course, he represents it as this existential problem, which is very true. It is an existential problem. It's something that Kierkegaard, Heidegger, and a lot of people wrestle with and call different things. For example, Heidegger would say you're thrown into the world and you have this angst there. And Kierkegaard, of course, is wrestling with that angst as well. And Sartre, perhaps existence precedes essence, idea to create meaning. So you're definitely putting it into that lens of existentialism. And we just have to kind of wrestle with these ideas and see how he develops them forward. Is this a childish view or whatever? I think he develops these points in a bit, so I will not respond to that yet. Let us carry on. Where was I yet? I don't know, whatever.
As highly irrational. See, if you were raised in a secular household, you would have never had a higher purpose inserted into your worldview. You'd have likely been encouraged to be your authentic self, to potentially embrace your desires and to chase your dreams. But if you're raised in a high control group or by highly devout religious parents, the question often isn't, what do you want to be? But rather, what does God want you to be? I was told from a young age that God did not want me to become a professional footballer, and so I didn't even...
Well, perhaps before he gives those examples, I'll just kind of illustrate what I'm trying to what the point here is. And he's saying, well, there's a difference between an atheistic family and a religious family. But I don't necessarily think that that's a correct distinction, but rather I think that both of these families or both of these situations can have a variety of different problems in different situations. For example, an Asian family, there's always going to be mandatory math classes, perhaps, mandatory Mandarin classes, perhaps, and these things are just part of being an Asian family. It doesn't matter whether you're religious or not, that's just something you have to deal with. It got nothing to do with anything else. And of course, you're most likely going to be doing med, law, or maybe engineering, and then maybe accounting. If you don't do those four things, then you're probably considered a failure. So, I mean, this idea of a high control group is correct in the sense that there are going to be situations where things are going to be based or people are going to impose certain restrictions on you. But that's not necessarily a distinction which I feel comes from a religious or a non-religious thing. It can happen in all situations. And also, I think that the presentation or the picture that is being painted here isn't exactly fair, not just because of what I've discussed before, but also the ideas that, well, Christianity is not based on all these restrictions. It's not just based on God's will. And there's this idea of Christianity that is being presented a lot by these modern day atheists, where they're like, Christianity is the Nietzschean idea of it. It's the destruction of the self, the lack of the individual, perhaps. But I don't necessarily think that that's the case, but rather that the entire Christian message is a wrestle between the two things. And not only is it saying that, well, it's only God's will, and of course God's will is important, and it's not to say that it's only your will, but rather that in some ways you have to understand God's will, you have to understand what is put in your life and what you're trying to do. And most likely than not, if you're following what is good in your life, or what is that which is the highest moral value or the highest value for you in your life, that would align with what is God's will for you. So it's not necessarily like, I have to get rid of everything in my life in order to follow God, or get rid of everything that God says to follow my life. A lot of times when you think deep enough about the questions in your life, you then realize that it actually is closer to the path that God wants you to be on than you first realize. And that's something which occurs in my life a lot. A lot of times I'll think initially that there are these contradictions, conflicts, and I completely understand where he could come from, especially if that is the family that he's living in. However, a lot of times at the same time, you have to be thinking further and also thinking about further implications and kind of deeper into actually what's going on here and understanding that as well. I hope that's clear. Of course, if you don't understand what I'm saying, let me know in the comments below.
Even go down the path. I stopped playing, as my dad suggested, at the age of 14. A few years later, I was told that God did not want me to go to university. That would lead me into a mixture of worldly association. Why would I want to spend the last few years before Armageddon trying to get letters after my own name?
And perhaps this is just a good example of me saying that his videos sometimes don't go against the ideas that I'm holding. And in this fact, I'll completely agree with him. I don't think the parents should be telling him don't play football or don't go to university. I think that's not very helpful. And I don't agree with that kind of high controlling nature of the parents. But I don't think that's necessarily a result of religion, as I've said previously. I love football, and if anyone told me to give up football, I'll probably punch them in the face and tell them to give them the bird and tell them to go away in more Christian appropriate language, I could say. Now let's continue watching the video.
What God wanted me to do was to devote 70 hours each month to my ministry and to present, hopefully, faith-strengthening talks to the congregation. What religion does so successfully, especially ones of a high-control nature like Jehovah's Witnesses, is inculcate and indoctrinate youngsters until they are completely dependent upon the religion, like a newborn baby is on breast milk. As long as you keep suckling at what you perceive to be the teat of God, which, by the way, is a great band name if you're trying to think of one, you'll never have to confront some of life's most hard-hitting philosophical questions, such as, why am I here? Does my life have purpose and meaning? You are told that because you are part of the one...
Well, perhaps I could, I'm not sure whether I should stop here or go on a bit further, but I suppose I can say stop here, say what I want, and then I'll refer back to it later. But I think that this is once again another of those situations where I think that his critique of Christianity in this situation is heavily dependent on the environment in which he rose up, and there's nothing wrong about that. I think the only way you could approach things is from the perspective that you grew up, right? That's almost a tautology, not in a logical sense, but almost on a humanistic sense. So as a result, I completely feel for him, though I don't necessarily think that being a good Christian necessarily means that you don't deal with life's hardest questions. I do a lot of philosophy, I do a lot of thinking. You can see the books back there. I'm not saying just because I read books I'm smart. That's definitely not what I'm saying. I know a lot of people who read books and don't know what on earth they're talking about, but I do read a lot of works by atheists and Christian thinkers alike. In the back, I have a bit of Camus, a bit of Sartre, a bit of Nietzsche, actually a lot of Nietzsche. That, when I did my research project, half of it was Nietzsche and half of it was Dostoevsky, so I do actually interact with a lot with these atheist thinkers. I have a lot of Dostoevsky, of course, Feuerbach and the like. So as a result, I wouldn't necessarily say that being a Christian necessarily leads you to not interact with life's hardest questions. I do agree that at certain times, religion can be used as a mean to stop people from believing in that way, though of course the same can be go, as he says, in any high control group. A lot of situations, or a lot of times, these things do indeed lead to indoctrination. Goes to atheistic organizations as well as religious organizations. For example, if you go back to Soviet Russia, I mean, blimey, that was as bad indoctrination as you can get, and Mao's China is the same alongside that as well.
True religion, your life is significant. God, Jesus, the angels, Satan, the demons are all watching you, and your conduct and behavior determines whether they are pleased or disappointed, whether you are helping to prove Satan a liar, whether you are advocating your support of God's universal sovereignty. Significant. You and your family, if you obey the rules of the religion, get to live in the proximity of God in heaven, or ruled by him in Christ Jesus on a paradise earth. Significant. From birth, you are drip-fed the ego-building narrative that your life is significant. But the primary reason this channel is called The Truth Hurts is because when I embraced my doubts, when I transitioned to basing my beliefs on evidence over emotion, I realised that my existence was truly insignificant. That I was...
Well, perhaps stop right there and say, well, and this is where I bring in the idea of the difference between meaning and science. It's not necessarily to say, well, I'm going against the truth to embrace what is human. And you could say, well, that's a childish belief or irrational belief. But I don't think that that's necessarily the case. No one lives based on this purely empirical idea. Like, the idea that you're embracing the insignificance of life leads to nihilism. And as you'll see later on in this video, the idea of the creation of values is itself not a scientific claim. Because where in science does it tell you to create a certain issue or a certain meaning? When you give beauty or meaning to the idea of reading the books, you might say, well, I find significance in understanding, finding the truth. But where exactly does that help in science? You don't necessarily see that in an empirical test or an empirical idea. All these ideas or concepts or tests which you make, maybe saying, well, someone who goes to education is more successful than someone who doesn't, maybe that's the scientific proof. But that is based on an underlying philosophical or a non-scientific based assumption that a success is based by a certain calculus or generated by a certain calculus. So the idea, I think, here is that, well, we really have to be separating the idea of, well, this is the meaning that I'm creating, which isn't necessarily based on the science. And, well, are you really following the science? Because they're two completely different things, and it's very important to separate between the two. And I want to make it very, very clear as well that I'm not saying that creating your meaning is wrong. I'm just saying that if you want to allow creation of meaning, you have to allow for other things. And they're both not rational. You cannot say one is irrational and the other one is not. They both are of the same existential action and the same existential type.
Was a walking, talking, averagely intelligent ape. There was no objective meaning or purpose. There was no grand hope for our species. I wouldn't get to dwell forever on a paradise earth or see my dead relatives again. Now, needless to say, in the wake of these sort of realizations, I was left feeling hollow, empty, and dissatisfied. Some people get depressed, even contemplating suicide. And so in part I can empathise with these sort of comments. Why then did I say that these questions were irrational? Well, irrespective of which branch of major monotheism, whether it be Judaism, Christianity, or Islam, theists are united in the fact that they...
Well, before we get into the point about major monotheistic religions, I do think that it does lead to angst, and this angst is something which has been struggling in philosophy for a long time, and I'll highly recommend you to read Sartre, read Heidegger, or read or maybe Kierkegaard, if you are interested in this video and you want to wrestle with the ideas that he is raising further in this video. I'll recommend those books a lot. I do think there are problems evident in each of those thinkers, and the more you read them, the more you'll understand where he's coming from and the different ideas which undergird the philosophy that he is talking about in this video. And I don't want to make this a lecture about Sartre or Heidegger or any of them, because that's going to go on forever. I mean, if you go to search a Heidegger series, I think that's like Being in Time itself was, 50 episodes of 1 hour long podcast or something like that. So I'm not going to try to attempt to do that here. I have other videos which you can check out about these thinkers, me and Warren discussing them. But I do think that that if you want to understand more about what he's talking about here, then go check those thinkers out. I think you'll find it very, very fruitful.
They view this life as the disappointing but necessary starter that they must consume in order to be rewarded by God, the Michelin-starred chef, with a heavenly main course. Atheists, on the other hand, view this life as the main course. Sure, some of it is unpleasant, some of it's bitter, but other parts are delicious and euphoric. And therefore, most atheists I know cherish each and every mouthful of the course because it's the only one they know they're going to get.
Now, I think we can stop it right there, and I think that the dynamic that he presents here isn't necessarily correct. The idea that the human life is the starter and the ultimate life is the main course, perhaps. I don't think that's necessarily the correct dynamic, but rather that they both are main courses in their own rights. So I think a lot of times people don't give credit to the Christian significance in the life in the present. The life that we live right now into the Christian worldview has existential and infinite significance on what happens in the second life as well. So it's not just saying, well, oh, let's get this over with as quick as possible, or oh, this has no value, but rather that everything in this world also has value. Every single action that you make in this world has existential significance in the life that you live in the second one, or not necessarily the life that you live in the second one, but rather what happens in the second one. Where are you in heaven or are you in hell? What you decide to do today reflects directly has infinite significance. And I would say that that doesn't devalue at all this main course, but rather makes it seem that it has all the more value. Because not only do you have only one life to choose what happens, but you also have that one life with infinite significance. So when there's this dynamic that he provides of this atheist viewing the current life as a main course, and Christians not valuing the first life and viewing the second life as the main course, I'll say that's a completely wrong dynamic, precisely because the Christian view points this life as that which has infinite significance, and perhaps in that lens, more significance than the view that the atheists provide. I'm not saying that atheists don't provide it with value. Rather, if you're looking at it from that perspective, the Christian perspective, I'm not sure about what the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. I'm not a Jehovah. I don't know anything. I do know a bit about it. I don't know a lot about it, so I'm not going to claim any knowledge about the worldview that he was providing. But I genuinely don't think that his arguments based on Jehovah's Witnesses do apply to the Christian view at all here.
As Ricky Gervais said, atheists have nothing to die for, but everything to live for. Now, not for a second am I saying that we should ask religious or non-religious people, why don't you kill yourself? But if I had to fire that question into one of the two groups, to me it would seem far more rational and justified to ask theists, well, why don't you just skip your starter and go straight to the main course? Now, as a former self-proclaimed Christian, I'm aware that the majority of theists would say suicide shows...
Well, perhaps I'll just stop it right there, and that just this is where it's very good that I raised it before, but this just points back to the previous, the negative point. It's like, not why don't you kill yourself, but rather why, what's the point in living or dying? There is no value at all, and you're reached with this nihilism. That is the question, not necessarily why do you kill yourself.
A blatant disregard for God's gift of life, and therefore I couldn't do it. I would respond by saying, let's hypothetically say that the Bible or the Torah or the Quran, depending on which branch of monotheism, said, if thou hateth this life and seeketh to end it, permissible it be in the sight of the Lord to kill thyself. Would you do it? I know that the majority of theists wouldn't. But why? Because whether they like to admit it or not, significant self-harm or suicide is completely counterintuitive to our survival and reproduction as animals. Just watch a film such as 127 Hours, based on the true story of a man named Aaron Ralston, who went out hiking and got his right arm caught between a boulder and part of a cliff or something, and was forced to amputate part of his own arm. The way we feel while watching that is just feeling someone else's pain and contemplating us doing that, let alone contemplating us taking our own life. Some believers would say, no, if I could, then I would.
Well, let's stop it right there, and I think that here is a slight slip of precisely what I was referring to as a separation between science and meaning. It's like, well, you're not killing yourself because of the science. But I don't necessarily think that that's the case, and I don't think it is psychologically the case. When we're looking at people, we live, we act, we base on meaning. Science doesn't tell the truth hurts to go make a YouTube channel. That's not found in any scientific literature. It's not found in an empirically proven sense. But rather, these are found via metaphysical ethical properties, perhaps, the need to search for the truth or the need to follow the truth. And these are not based on science. You don't find these on science. Science is based on them, not the other way around. For example, where exactly does science come from? What is the purpose of science? Well, it's clearly not found in science. That becomes circular. If you say, well, for example, maybe why is the Bible important? Well, because the Bible tells me so. I mean, that is quite a circular argument. In the same way, if you say, well, the only reason I'm following science is because science tells me to do that. It's like, well, that's not exactly the case here. We have ultimate values in life which dictate the actions and the value that we provide in other things. And as a result, when he says, well, I'm just an ape, or our actions are based on this survival instinct just because we're animals, I don't think that fully explains. I think it's quite clear that doesn't explain the full human experience and what we are interacting with.
But you see, the problem is, I have a partner and I have children, so I couldn't do that to them.
Let me go back a bit. So, I mean, I could let him start the sentence and end it.
If I could, then I would. But you see, the problem is, I have a partner and I have children, so I couldn't do that to them. Now, unknowingly, at that point, the theist would acknowledge and recognise the fact that forming relationships, propagating our genes through reproduction, and then taking care of our family, our children, ensuring their survival and passing on of our genetics, is of utmost importance. Not just in a way of deriving meaning and purpose to our species, but to many others. And it has nothing to do with a god or gods.
Now, I think that this is another one of those problems between the science and the meaning of life. It's like the reduction. I don't get. I think that this is a very childish psychological belief that. Let's hear it again. I think that will make it very clear.
At that point, the theist would acknowledge and recognise the fact that forming relationships, propagating our genes through reproduction, and then taking care of our family, our children, ensuring their survival and passing on of our genetics, is of utmost importance.
Now he says forming relationships and then propagating our genetics and creating this reproduction line in a scientific sense. That puts them all together. I'll say that is incorrect. no one forms relationships just because, oh, science tells me to do that. You don't have your girlfriend. You're not married to someone, oh, just because I want to scientifically pass down the species or genes. There is an experience of love. There's an experience of meaning, the value that you put to the relationship, which goes way beyond the mere scientific explanation of it. Like if your wife asks you, oh, why do you love me? Or your girlfriend asks you, why do you love me? I mean, I know you lads out there, it's a trick question. Don't fall for that trick. But if they do ask you, why do you love me? And you respond by saying, oh yes, because of evolution. Guess what's going to happen? Are they going to be like, oh, you're so honest, you're so smart, you're following the truth? Or are they going to slap you across the face? The second is way more likely than the first. So as a result, it's almost incompatible, or it seems to me very childish to try to compare the two together and try to reduce the significance of these relationships to purely the scientific calculation of what we experience. And that's just what I mean by the difference between meaning and science, which I don't necessarily think that The Truth Hurts. I should have researched his name before I made this video. I'm really sorry. But I don't think he interacts with or actually fully explains.
Not just in a way of deriving meaning and purpose to our species, but to many others. And it has nothing to do with a god or gods. When you reflect and dissect your own life, your family's lives, you will see that this becomes abundantly clear. Take, for example, my mother. Once my brother and I left school and moved on with our lives, she lost all sense of meaning and purpose. Her alcoholism plummeted to unparalleled levels that she would never recover from. In my own life, as a Jehovah's Witness in my early 20s, religion, Jehovah's Witnesses, the ministry, the meetings, what was at one point at the forefront of my life and my mind, took a back seat when I started dating my wife. My focus completely shifted. My meaning and purpose became developing a relationship and making her happy. Think of some of the most memorable and meaningful personal experiences in your life. You may say, well, April...
Well, I think that is definitely something which he points out is very interesting. It's like, well, there are a lot of significant things in our lives and we have a lot of different priorities. And I think that's very true. It's very clear. And I don't think that the Christianity is necessarily going against the idea that you can have these priorities, you have these significant things in your life. It's not saying, well, you can't have these relationships. It's not a completely nihilistic faith. And I think that this is perhaps the Nietzschean kind of contribution to the discussion, where Nietzsche says, well, oh, Christianity is this negating religion which goes against the value that you put forward, or it goes against the what it means to be human, perhaps, the will to power. But in reality, I don't think that's the case. Christianity does allow for these important things. And when you say you love God first, doesn't mean that you love anything less, but rather that you have an ultimate priority and you use that lens to judge everything else. And you realize that the lens in which it provides is completely compatible to having beautiful relationships with each other, beautiful caring relationships with other people around you. And there's nothing wrong with that as well.
8, 2012, the day I got baptized. Don't worry, no one from your church is here. You can be honest. The most meaningful personal experiences someone goes through aren't objective, nor do they have heavenly repercussions. Whether it be a once-in-a-lifetime holiday with your friends when you're younger, a first kiss with your true love, or the birth of your first child. These experiences are subjective, they are short-lived, they are fleeting, but that's precisely what makes them so precious to you. You're not proving Satan a liar. You're not advocating your support of God in battle for universal sovereignty. You're not solving world hunger or creating a free, unlimited, abundant source of energy to serve the planet. You are living, just like every other animal. And so when someone says, if this is all the life, then is it worth living?
Well, I think before we move on, I think that's completely correct, and I completely agree with him. I mean, what is significant, what's the most beautiful moment in your life is precisely that which isn't scientifical. It's not that which cannot be proved. And that's the same thing which I'm trying to explain this entire video, is that these ideas of creation of meaning, these value, these existential statements got nothing to do with the science, the empirical facts. And when someone tries to bring empirical facts to the table, it just blows my mind away. Exactly in the same way that his mind is blown away when he's calling that as childish. And that's exactly what I mean by the separation between science and meaning as well. When you're interacting with these relationships, when you're forming these relationships, that's the same as, well, I had a beautiful experience with someone. I had a beautiful trip with someone. Got nothing to do with the science behind it. I mean, it's just childish to me to think that life can be reduced to that sense. And as a result, I think that his point here precisely goes against what he said previously about the relationship between science and meaning, and that as well.
In effect, what they are asking is, if this life is only temporary, what's the point? Now, to highlight how absurd that question is, imagine going up to a homeless man and offering him £80. He takes the money, he looks at it, and he throws it in your face. And he says, £80. I either want billions of pounds or nothing. You wouldn't know what to say, you'd be completely shocked. You'd think he was entirely delusional. And yet that's exactly the same as someone who says, on average 80 to 100 years, 80 measly years on this planet, what's the point? I either want billions and billions of years with God in his immense presence in the heavens, or nothing. Perhaps you realise how illogical and irrational these sorts of points are. Perhaps you're newly encountering atheism as a thought concept for the first time, and you're wondering, I have a hole left in me by religion.
Well, I think that is a false analogy. The religious situation, as I've said, the landscape that we painted, and you could go back to the previous part of the video, is not about this idea of the full forsakenness of the present for the infinity of the future, but rather the significance, the infinite significance of the present for the infinite significance, or even the infinity of the future. So the idea that there is this kind of different situation isn't exactly the case. And once again, you can go back to the previous part where I say that the statement here is not necessarily you should go kill yourself, but rather, oh, all things are permissible. So the idea of the positive changing to the negative is, or the active to the passive is precisely the key here, which shows that the analogy provided here isn't necessarily accurate or correct.
And I'm wondering, will it ever be filled? The answer to that question comes from an unlikely source. It's a series called Vikings, Series 4, and it's a conversation between English monarch King Egbert and Viking raider Ragnar Lothbrok.
Now, I don't want to play this just in case something happens and I get a copyright strike. I mean, he probably didn't get a copyright strike given that it's still there, but I'll skip through it. You could probably see what's going on. It's like, what if your god did not exist? Your god, my gods, what if they don't exist? What on earth does that mean? Well, if there were no gods, then anyone could do anything. Nothing would matter. If they don't exist, then they don't exist. We have to live with it. Okay, let's go on. I don't want to get... I'm sorry, I'm kind of paranoid about this stuff.
The reason I love that clip so much is because it provides a very realistic insight into two different stages of contemplating an atheistic worldview. On the one hand, you had this English monarch, King Egbert, who probably had never considered this before, and so he was thrust straight into an existential crisis. He said, if the gods don't exist, then nothing would be real or have meaning or value. And yet, on the other hand, you have Ragnar Lothbrok, someone who, according to the series, had considerable time to be able to contemplate the permutations of atheism in his life. And his response was, well, everything has meaning. Now, I wouldn't say that Egbert was wrong and that Ragnar was right or vice versa. I would just say that they were at different stages in their journey. A journey that begins at nihilism, at coming face to face with the uncomfortable truth, the crashing and burning of lofty, anthropocentric religious beliefs, and being hit around the back of the head by a cold, hard smack of reality. It's only once we become used to that and comfortable with it can we then begin to build subjective meaning and purpose into our lives.
Well, I think that this is a very beautiful point, and I think that it is correct in the sense that, well, the movement of the atheist person with meaning is precisely from one which is religious at the beginning, when he's in Christianity or Muslim or whatever. Then he moves to a sense of nihilism, a non-religious theme. Then he moves back to a religious lens, a religious landscape of meaning, of value. And in this sense, it is perhaps the recognition of in one sense, the value and the significance of meaning, and then it moves to the idea of the worship of science, the pure facts, this idea that empiricism is everything you want. Then the moment you start accepting meaning again, that everything has value, you move away from that and you move to a return perhaps to the religious realm, but under another name, and that of meaning, subjective meaning that you create. So in some sense, I think that what The Truth Hurts doesn't recognize here is precisely that the two ends that he's describing aren't as far apart as one may think. They actually are one and the same, or perhaps two sides of the same coin. You go away from it to escape perhaps this religious things for whatever meaning you want. Then you come back and realize that, well, perhaps I've missed the entire point, and that there are some things of that past religious nature which are valuable. And as a result, I must recreate it. I must create it. But instead of having that God or whatever existential meaning you have behind it, I must create it for myself, a creatio ex nihilo perhaps. And as a result, under that circumstance, then you find meaning, then you create meaning. And ultimately you realize that you have returned into a same lens the same lens that you have begun with. And that's exactly what I think is being overseen here. And I think that the presentation that he has in this last part is very noteworthy and very interesting.
What form does this usually manifest itself in? I would say hope. By getting this new job, I hope I can provide more adequately for my family. By donating to that charity, I hope it will benefit those animals or those people. By reducing my carbon footprint, I hope that we won't destroy the planet. By producing this YouTube video, I hope it will potentially benefit one or two people. When you analyse the lives of many non-religious people, it becomes clear that they derive meaning and purpose in the hope that their behaviour and work is benefiting others. 1 Corinthians 13:11 states, "When I was a child, I used to speak as a child, to think as a child, to reason as a child. But now that I have become a man, I have done away with the traits of a child." Without a doubt, a childish trait of our species was the superstition that there must exist a higher purpose beyond ourselves. But once we've escaped that superstition, once we've emancipated ourselves from the chains of religious thinking, we can then become accustomed at saying, I don't know, and I don't need to know. All we know with any certainty is that against almost infinitesimal odds, almost incalculable odds, we are here. And that should fill us with far more awe, humility, and appreciation than we ever had for life as believers.
Well, that's where I'll completely disagree with it. I think that there is nothing wrong with recognizing the infinitesimal odds of you being here and still being a believer and finding great value in that, and perhaps even more value through your faith through that. And furthermore, as I've said previously, there is precisely this idea of the religious landscape, where you go back to the religious landscape where you started off with. And this idea of the creation, this idea of moving from the child towards a man. I'll actually agree with him, and I'll say, well, but I'll switch it a bit in saying that was precisely the movement from a child to think that you've actually done something new. And it goes to the man, the thinking of the man, who recognizes that you've actually returned to the religious landscape that you have started off with. I think that that is precisely what has to be understood in the existentialist sense, and that's at least that's a sentiment that you get when you're reading Sartre, when you're reading Heidegger, when you're reading Nietzsche, when you're reading Kierkegaard. Of course, Kierkegaard's a bit of an exception because he is actually a Christian writer, but especially with Heidegger, he moves beyond this idea of the religious landscape, but then he once again towards the end returns to religious views. Humans are the shepherd of being. Well, what on earth does that mean? It has religious connotations as well. So I think that it is precisely this idea that he touches upon. It's moving away from the child to the man. That we realize that instead of actually going completely against it, we are actually supporting this religious landscape, this religious view. And of course, this religious I'm using in a very broad term, not necessarily Christianity or Muslim, but rather this idea of meaning. We've gone beyond the science as a species to accept the meaning. And that's not something childish. It's not something childish to accept meaning, to accept value. As he says, there's nothing wrong with creating this intrinsic value, or not necessarily intrinsic value, but creating this subjective value. There's nothing wrong with it, but rather we just have to understand, and it takes great, I think, honesty to understand that there are times where you're going beyond the science. It's not all about the science. It's not all about these empirical facts, but rather it is because you are human. You live as a being in this world. And via living as a being in this world, you then have to deal with the existential problem of angst, which surrounds you. And that is the starting point of your philosophy. That's the starting point of your life. And it's not necessarily all about, oh, science, truth, oh, this truth is contradicting this or this and that. That is precisely what brings you away from one of the religious into the land of the empirical. And that land of the empirical alone is insufficient to save your soul. And that's precisely what you see in Dostoevsky, in The Grand Inquisitor, and Ivan Karamazov, where he says, well, when he goes mad at the end, it's precisely the idea that you've gone from the world of meaning, the religious meaning, to the world of the Enlightenment, the Euclidean mind, in Dostoevsky's terms. And precisely in that Euclidean mind, you realize how empty it is. And unless you return to this religious state by creating your meaning or finding religion, you then will lead to madness. And that's precisely what Dostoevsky's project is. And I think that this, what he says here actually supports the argument instead of going against it as he suggests.
We look out at an expanding universe, at nothingness with no apparent meaning, and the sheer pointlessness of life on our planet. But that pointlessness to life isn't something to be overcome. It is to be celebrated and embraced. A meaningless universe doesn't mean that we live our lives without meaning, for it enables us to create our own.
I think that was a decent video. I think we do agree in way more than you might have thought in the beginning. I hope you've enjoyed it, hope you found it fruitful. Let me know if you like this new structure where I talk about the key concepts before and then after that talk about the videos so I can refer back to them. Let me know your thoughts about that. Also, if you are interested in this content, then feel free to interact with the works of Sartre, Heidegger, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard. Of course, Heidegger is perhaps the most difficult, and Nietzsche are perhaps the most difficult to read. I think Sartre can be seen as a more easy read. Camus as well, there are more easy reads, lighter reads. And I would recommend you not to touch into Heidegger, Nietzsche, or Dostoevsky. Well, actually, Dostoevsky you can from a literary perspective, but as a philosophical perspective, I'll recommend you to maybe read the other books first, just for sake of understanding. Hope you enjoy this video. Of course, if you agree or disagree with anything, let me know in the comments below. I'll happily interact with your ideas there. Like always, stay safe, my friends. It means a lot to me if you like and subscribe. Stay safe. See you soon. Thank you for watching, and goodbye. I'll see you in the next one.